I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's events. My name is Nick Breyfogle. I am from the History Department at Ohio State. I'm also the director of the Harvey Goldberg Center for Excellence in Teaching. And one of the things we do at the Goldberg Center is to sponsor public talks like this one. The event tonight is a marvelous new, what should we call it, joint venture. It's brought to us by the Clio Society, which I'll say a word about in a moment. Also by the marvelous Berkeley Public Library, who does fabulous programming like this on a regular basis. You should all come out every night, every day to learn. And by the equally marvelous Gramercy Bookstore, which is just across the street. It is one of the great independent bookstores, not just of Central Ohio or the Midwest, but of our nation indeed. And so, not to be too shameless in plugging, but there are some books back there that our fabulous speaker has written, brilliant award-winning stuff, and so feel free to take them home. They make excellent stocking stuffers, and is an extraordinarily gripping, if slightly scary read when you realize, and you'll maybe never drink Coke products again. But there you go. Don't tell Ohio State I said that. So, as I mentioned, the talk tonight is part of a series that we do through the Clio Society. The Clio Society was around for several years. It's named after the muse of history, Clio. And the Clio Society is a kind of community of people who have come together over the years to share their passion for history, to be kind of lifelong learners, and to give an opportunity for us in the history department to kind of show off all the great things that we do and great faculty members that we have, like Bart. And if you would like to know more about the Clio Society, I'd be happy to tell people. And there is, in fact, a sign-up sheet at the back, just on the table there, being held up by our friend Whitney, where you can sign up if you want to receive information about future events. Before I introduce Bart, let me say two things. One is, please mark your calendars for April 1st, yes, April Fool's Day. We'll be back here for our spring Clio talk, which will be by Sarah Butler, which will be the medieval origins of the Me Too movement. So medieval women's rights setting the stage for today. It's going to be awesome. So yes, you'll never forget April Fools, right? It's no joke. Come on back. The other thing is that I just want to announce we have a former student here who is working with the Columbus Bill of Rights. And this is a very important initiative which is attempting to protect the water supply for Columbus, Ohio, and around. There is a petition in the back. That's right, there's a petition in her hand that you should feel free to sign. I encourage you, hope that you might sign. If you're a Columbus resident. All you suburban people, not for you, just for Columbus residents. But it's an important, very important initiative. She has information here for you if you'd like to learn more about this particular issue. And it fits perfectly with the topic of our talk tonight, which is going to be given by our friend here, Bart Elmore. He is an associate professor in the history department and is one of the founding members of Ohio State's excellent new Sustainability Institute. We're going to solve the world's sustainability problems. Yes, we will, and after that, we'll cure all the diseases, and off we go. He is a teacher of modern European, that's me, modern American history, the history of business and capitalism.
I was starting to get nervous.
I was going to say, yeah, the things he knows about Southeast Asia. And sorry, American history, modern American history, history of business and capitalism, and environmental history. He was the 2018 recipient of one of OSU's Alumni Distinguished Teaching Awards, which is the most prestigious teaching award that you can get at Ohio State. Only 10 are given out every year. Bart in his first year? First year? Second year. Didn't waste any time, our friend here. He was awarded this teaching award, and you'll see why in a moment. He's also the award-winning author of our book back there, which you'll talk about tonight, Citizen Coke, the Making of Coca-Cola Capitalism. He has a vast list of articles. He's an active historian in the public square. He has a TED Talk you can see online. He's been interviewed for all sorts of documentaries and podcasts and newspaper and other types of articles. He is also, the list goes on, it's amazing. I picked just a few things, but he was also a Carnegie Fellow for the New America Foundation. And New America funds, and I quote them, thinkers whose work enhances the public conversation about the most pressing issues of the day. He is also completing 2 other books right now, just in his spare time. One is called Seed Money, which is a history of the Monsanto Corporation, and another called The Land Where the Sun Never Sets. Well, this is a great title, The American South and Planetary Ecological Change. Awesome. Tonight, Bart's going to talk to us about what the history of Coke can teach us about curbing pollution. Thank you.
Thank you all for being out here, and thanks so much to Nick. It's so fun to be introduced by somebody that you is a great friend, but somebody that you deeply admire, really, seriously. And we've been working on a water film together recently and all this. So he is saving the planet, I should say, every day when he comes into work. So, and also thank you to Berkeley Books. This is super nice for you all to be here and to have the book with us. And of course, the Berkeley Library, this is great. And to Laura, who's filming, and I promise I'll try not to move too much, as I like to do going along. Laura's fantastic, and it really helps out with all this. So thank you all for being here. And what we're going to do today is just a little journey into a small little company called Coca-Cola. And here we see Citizen Coke, as I like to call him, on the cover of Time magazine in 1950, truly emblematic of the fact that it had become a global brand by 1950. Some cocktail hour kind of fun trivia. I'll try and throw things out for you guys to use. It's second only to the word okay in terms of recognized words around the world. And it sells today about 1.9 billion servings of its product every single day. Every single day, right? So it's a remarkable firm. And I have to say, when I went to graduate school, I didn't really think I was going to write about this company that started from my hometown. I grew up in Atlanta, and so I was from Coke country and was surrounded by the brand. But when I went to graduate school, I was going to write about American missionary teachers in the South and public education, because that's what I had done before I went to grad school, and thought that's what I would do. And so I went to work with this big Southern historian, and his name was Ed Ayers, and then I found this field of environmental history that studies this relationship between humans and the natural environment. And I thought, oh man, I have to abandon this famous scholar I'm going to work with. What am I going to do? And then I realized, no, I can still work with them. I'll just have to pick a Southern firm that changed the world. And so that was kind of the origins of this project. It's kind of a Southern history story of a company that started from my hometown, but also an environmental history of this firm. It looks at the environmental impact of this company. And I had a very, very personal connection to Coca-Cola from really kind of day one. Because I went to the high school, which was Georgia Military Academy, that's what it was called back in the day, which was the same school that a very young Robert Woodruff, who ran the company from the 19-teens up through the 1980s, went to. And I really love this archival picture because Robert Woodruff is really pissed off in this picture. And it's because he had to wear this crummy uniform and all this stuff. And so I felt a certain kinship to him because it was kind of a mess. And every day we'd go into school, as you see, it's kind of almost like a prison. We'd see Robert Woodruff here with his cigar. I'm not sure what that was supposed to teach us about tobacco consumption as high school students, but we were surrounded by him, and I think we were taught, here's this charitable company that does all these great things. Emory University, the Woodruff Arts Center, Atlanta was Coke country in so many ways. So I got it. Coke has done some good charitable things, but as an environmental historian, my question was, well, let's look beyond it. Let's look at the company in its totality. Let's think about was the impact of this firm around the world? And I think the simplest, see some of the graduate students, Mike and others who are here, thinking about how do you write these big projects. You want to start with a big, simple question. And so mine was essentially this. WTF, right? How on earth did, a company that started in Atlanta, Georgia, selling a brain tonic, in the original advertising it said it eliminates brain worry, which I guess we all have, especially this time of year, but whatever that is. In this small town in the Jim Crow South in the 1880s, how did it end up doing this? And this is just 1996 consumption, and it shows you, 10 fluid ounce servings above 250. You can see this kind of saturation in North America. And these open markets, of course, this is, of course, what all the folks at Coca-Cola see. This is where they're targeting most of their growth today. But the question was, how did it end up in over 190 countries? I think they say they're in 200 countries. It's like more than belongs to the United Nations. What are they adding up? I don't know. But they say they're everywhere. And how did they do it? And I think this is where environmental history is fun, because I see Kip, who studied with one of the founders of the field. This field was really about saying, okay, well, let's put nature at the center of this story. And most histories of Coca-Cola had been about cuddly polar bears and smiling GIs and Santa Claus, right? It was advertising that really sold Coca-Cola around the world, that's what made them great. And I think there's no doubt that that's true, that they were really brilliant at marketing and pushing their advertising. But as an environmental historian, it just wasn't satisfying. How did they get the stuff, the caffeine, the sugar, the aluminum, to put their products all around the world and to sell it at such low cost? They were the largest sugar consumer on the planet by the 19-teens. And it was remarkable the amount of stuff they were consuming. Largest consumer of processed caffeine in the world. Where does it come from? You think about that. Well, the participatory thing, I want you to actually think about, where would Coke's caffeine come from? Because I had no idea, right? And so I journeyed around and said, let's look at each ingredient and see what we can say about how they got those natural resources. And I was a bit of our chair of our department's here, so I should say, I shouldn't say this, but I was a lazy graduate student. And so I came up with a simple organizational scheme to kind of try and structure this argument. And I basically ripped the back of a Coke container, and the table of contents is the ingredients. So it's the ingredient list is kind of what I did. And I looked at carbonated water. Sucrose was a real freaking mess, because it ended up blowing up into aspartame and high fructose corn syrup, so I ended up with 3 chapters there, a bunch of different chapters. And then natural flavors. I could have chosen all, 19 natural flavors, but I would never have gotten my doctorate. So I basically said, let's just choose one, and the most important one to me was the coca leaf, because of its importance to the trademark name. And we'll talk about that today. I know it's late in the evening, so trust me, I've got cocaine in this, I've got caffeine in this, we're going to keep you hopped up. And caffeine. And so the question was, where did they get this stuff? How did they do it? And even the packaging itself, right? And so that's what each chapter really did. So I'll lead with the big findings. And what I think was most interesting about this journey was it led me down paths I never intended to go down. What I started to see was really Coke's secret formula of how they made money. What was kind of impressive about how they did it was that they didn't make stuff, and they didn't own things. They proved particularly adept at outsourcing the majority of the cost of actually making the thing that they were making. Right? So they didn't own sugar plantations in the Caribbean. They didn't own decaffeination plants in the United States or high fructose corn syrup wet mills in the Midwest, but relied on a host of independent suppliers, some of who you see here, to get them their natural resources, to get them the things that they needed. And I should say that other companies followed a very different model. Hershey Chocolate Company was one of Coke's largest sugar suppliers. And they did own their own sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Cuba. And ultimately they found out, that's really risky business. Why own all those plantations? I mean, you've got all these natural disasters and weather could be really tricky. You've got laborers and unrest. And so they actually outsourced the majority of those farms and plantations and decided it was much smarter just to buy that stuff on the open market, to be a kind of middleman in the system, not be the actual maker of the stuff. So caffeine, I'll come back to that, and this is kind of, we'll start a little bit of the Q&A. Like, where would you guess Coca-Cola got their caffeine from? So you said coffee beans, right? That was like the first thing I thought of, right? I thought, it's gotta be coffee, right? And of course, we're both wrong. Any other guesses what it might be?
Tea.
And then the second thing was tea, and that would be correct. So originally, the way that Coca-Cola got their caffeine was from broken and damaged tea leaves that were left on the floor of tea exchanges around the world, right? So, back in the 1880s, 1890s, and in the early 1900s, people really wanted to see their nice tea when they were having their tea, and they would dip it in, and this was kind of how they did it. So there was a lot of garbage, and it's actually, you could argue, it's kind of environmentally good. It's recycling that waste. They would sweep up those sweepings, that's what they were called, tea sweepings, or waste tea leaves, and they would process out this drug, essentially, caffeine, that they could put in their drink. And it was great. And it'd be fun if the story ended there, but it gets weirder, because they got bigger, and so they needed more caffeine. And that's when coffee actually started being important. In the 1950s, decaf coffee started taking off. And the early 20th century, it was fun to go back and look at this. Like, why would you drink coffee without caffeine? That's the whole point of the thing, And they would write about that. That's the silliest product I've ever heard of. But in the 50s, there's this concern. Caffeine is making people nervous and all this stuff. And decaf coffee emerges. And so originally, interestingly, that waste tea leaves, that was being processed by Monsanto. Monsanto would not exist as a company. And today they sell, they're bought by Bayer, but they sold genetically engineered seeds. But it started with caffeine and actually saccharin. They were selling artificial sweetener to Coca-Cola. They were using saccharin as a cheaper way of sweetening their products long before they even created Diet Coke or anything like that. So anyway, that was the original thing. But then in the 50s, they switched to General Foods and the Maxwell House coffees. When those were decaffeinated, if you've ever wondered where did all that caffeine go, it ended up going into the soft drink industry. And it'd be fun if the story just ended there, but then it got weirder. Because I was like, okay, well, what happened later when they got even bigger? And they needed more caffeine. And the answer is, they got it from coal tar. So they figured out, Monsanto was working for them and figured this out, that you could basically methylate urea that was found in coal tar and turn it into caffeine. Now, interestingly, Coke at first balked at using that synthetic because they said urea. This is true. This is what's so fun about this kind of history is you find these awesome interviews where the guy says, urea, it sounds too much like urine. And people are going to think they're drinking pee. And Coke really did. They said, no, we're not going to use that artificial thing. We want only natural sourcing. And then they realized, well, no one's going to ask where their caffeine comes from. Put the stuff in there. And in the 60s, we know they changed. So this is why Coca-Cola doesn't like me speaking. They will say on their website that, they source their caffeine from coffee beans, so decaf tea leaves, so the waste tea, that's still a process, and appropriate sources. And appropriate sources is fossil fuels. And now today, it's largely from natural gas and coming from China. It's one of the main suppliers of synthetic caffeine. Man, that was a mess of a story and a tangent. But hey, it was fun. That was the front end of the story, is this kind of supply side story. They outsourced the majority of that. And look, a lot of companies did this. It's not to suggest Coke was the only company that did it, but they did it so well. And what I started noticing in the archives was, this was their motto: we don't own things. And they would have these young whippersnappers from Harvard University come in from business school and say, own things, vertically integrate. That's what you're supposed to do. That's how you make profits. And they get slapped down by Robert Woodruff. Don't tell us, don't go buy orange groves in Brazil. We don't want to do that. You know, we always operate at arm's length. And that's why when they switch to high fructose corn syrup, folks, they can do it, right? If something better comes along, there's a sweetener, and it's cheaper, whatever. We don't own all this infrastructure. They were nimble. It was really a remarkable system. And it was the same on the back end. You know, they didn't own most of their distribution network for most of their history. The 80s, they started buying up bottlers, and we can talk about that. But for most of their history, they outsourced it. It was local soda fountain operators and local bottlers. They started bottling in 1899, who paid for, you know, the water, which is 80% of what they sold to the public, and the gas for the trucks, the workers, all that infrastructure to get Coke to market. This is one of my favorite pictures because this is actually the entire salaried staff of the Coca-Cola Corporation at the end of the 1890s. And folks, they're in every single state in the country. That's how you make money. The Candlers in Atlanta, you meet Candler the 9th and Candler the 10th today when you're walking around Atlanta, and they're very, very wealthy. And part of that is because Asa Candler, who ended up buying out this brand right there, that's one of his happier days. You kind of see him smiling there. Just amassed this incredible fortune because, again, the overhead for Coke was really low in a remarkable way. They were just selling these syrup jugs. It was like Microsoft. You know, instead of selling like these big computers, they were selling originally these floppy disks. The floppy disk just happened to be syrup, right? And so, for me, I think that was really one of the big findings was that I started seeing that how Coke made money, why it became one of the most profitable companies in the world, was that it acted as a commodity broker. It was a middleman, right? It was like it made money off that transaction between these independent producers and independent distributors, and it made money off that flow of stuff through the system, never really holding on to it for very long. And Coke, again, is not the only exemplar of this model. My whole point, and this is what people say, well, that's a lot of companies. I said, that's why I wrote the book. Because I think this became one of the models for how you think about the top most profitable companies today. A lot of them are brokers of sorts, right? Not makers of wares, makers of stuff. And I think they started this really early, and they were a great paragon of the model. Okay, now that's the boring, dry academic stuff. Or maybe not, I don't know. So let's turn to some really interesting things, because I promised you that what I would do today is try and suggest how does this history of Coke help us think about how we can curb pollution and help the environment. And so to do that, what I want to do is focus on one ingredient that I looked at. And that ingredient was the packaging itself. Glass, aluminum, the various containers that they use. So we're going to talk about packaging. And to do that, we have to go back to the beginning of Coke. And this is the guy who created Coca-Cola. His name's John Pemberton. And the truth is, actually, this is what Coke puts out as John Pemberton. This is who they say John Pemberton probably is, but we don't think that's actually John Pemberton. We think this guy is John Pemberton. And the reason is because he doesn't have that beautiful beard, and he's kind of thinning in hair, he's looking a little sickly, and that makes more sense. Because John Pemberton was a Confederate veteran who had been shot and slashed with a saber defending the city of Columbus, Georgia. So much fun with that. Because that was the only Columbus I knew growing up, you know. And Columbus, Georgia, in April of 1865. Now this is no fun with a bunch of historians in the room, but April of 1865. Why is that significant?
April 12th.
Exactly. So he's getting tore up as Grant and Lee are signing the terms of surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, right? And it's almost like worthless. So this poor guy gets tore up, and it's kind of not even a significant battle. And there's John Pemberton. So if you're take note of all these things, right? He's really hurt. So as a result, he gets addicted to morphine. And there's clear evidence of this, that he is really trying to deal with these problems. He has these major stomach ailments, as you might imagine from a woman like that back in the day. And so he struggles for much of the rest of his life with morphine addiction. So he's sick, he's on drugs, and he decides that he's going to go to Atlanta in the 1870s. And you might say, well, at least he had money. And the answer there is no. His business burns down, not once, but twice. So again, if we're keeping track now, he's like sick, he's on drugs, and he has no money. Sounds like the guy's going to create the best brand the world's ever done. And the answer is no. And let's go back to the prettier picture. There we go. That's a nice John Pemberton. So how does this John Pemberton, how do we come to create something that's going to be so great the world will know it everywhere? And the answer is that you knock someone off. You take a drink that's doing really, really well around the world and you copy it. And that's exactly what Coke did. And I think the great irony here is that Coke made most of its history out of trying to legally fight other companies that were trying to copy it. But from the very beginning, Coca-Cola was a complete carbon copy of this weird drink. And this weird drink is...
Carbonated copy.
Yeah, a carbonated copy. Very good. And this one was just actually not carbonated yet because it was wine. It was a Bordeaux wine, a red wine, mixed with the coca leaf that would have infused it with small quantities of the alkaloid and what we'd see in street cocaine. So you're basically talking about cocaine-infused wine. Now with my students, they definitely get this. I say it's like the Four Loko of the 19th century. This drink that was designed to have this alcohol that also kind of pick you up. And everybody loved it. There are testimonials from Queen Victoria in England saying this is great stuff. Our president, Ulysses S. Grant, drank Vin Mariani. It's awesome and delicious. Of course it is. Ulysses S. Grant, it has cocaine in it. And so this is true, folks. This is the original. I pulled this from ProQuest to show you all today. The original 1885 Pemberton's Wine of Coca. Not very original. It's a complete copy, just a different name. A red wine mixed with the coca leaf that would again infused it with a small cocaine. And of course, Gilded Age, they can say whatever they want. There's no advertising laws or anything else. Does it sell 500 bottles a day? We don't know. But we know that people liked it. And why not? What an upper. Good drink. The issue with Coke and Pemberton at this point, and this is just so sad, right? He's drugged up, he's sick, he's poor, and now he's finally got something that's selling. And then the city of Atlanta comes in and says, nope. And the issue wasn't the cocaine. It was the alcohol. And he's like, no, are you kidding me? I've got to create a temperance version of this drink that will never sell. I'm going to replace the wine and put carbonated water in it. And folks, that is why it looks the way it does. That's why it's sweet. You think about this wine, he's trying to kind of come up with something that's a temperance version of it, where the base is carbonated water and not wine, but that'll have a similar taste and feel. Yes, it had the coca leaf in it. Yes, it would have had, as a result, small quantities, and we're talking very small quantities of the alkaloid cocaine in the drink. So it's all true. And here we see what it looked like. It's sold for 5 cents. They actually gave it away for free. One of the smart marketing strategies at the time, because hey, it's got cocaine in it, caffeine, sugar, carbonated water, tastes delicious. People are going to come back and want it, right? So it was incredible. But here's the thing: John Pemberton dies. I mean, the guy finally creates something. He finally tinkers with it. He creates a temperance drink people are going to drink, and then he dies. So it's just a tragic story for him. I wish we had a better ending, but for him, that's it. And it's this guy, Asa Candler, the happiest man on the planet, as you can see here. Again, this was a good effort on my part. Get him. You can kind of see a little bit it's turning up as he's getting there. But he, is this kind of puritanical Sunday school teacher from Atlanta, and he takes over the brain. He's a pharmacist who sees this. He says, we can make something out of this drink, and he takes it over. And I said I was going to talk about packaging. This is the key moment. Candler does two really, really important things. The first is he takes out the cocaine. But, and this is really, really important, he leaves the coca leaf as a secret ingredient in the drink. And again, I have to be very careful because we have a camera on and everything else. I stopped researching this book around 2013, 2014. But at that point, all the evidence suggested that the coca leaf was still in the drink. Can I say it's still in there today? My bet is, of course it is. But I can't prove it because I'm no longer in the archives looking at all the details and not looking at import, thank goodness, logs of coca leaves coming into the United States. But this is as clear as day in the National Archives. This is true. This is something that's not contested if you're looking at the evidence. The coca leaf remained in the drink, and it's secret ingredient number 5. Hi, Coke. Secret ingredient number 5 in the drink. They actually call it merchandise number 5. And this is what it is. You're going to be Peru, okay? So Peru is here. Peru trades their coca leaves to this company, Maywood Chemical Company, in New Jersey, okay? And Maywood Chemical Company takes out the cocaine for Coca-Cola and then sells, you're going to be Coke, the leftover Coke essence to Coca-Cola. And it's one of those delicious things that Coke loves because it's one of these secret ingredients. That's awesome. Now, all that cocaine, what happened to it, right? Sold on the open market, black market. That wasn't at all. It was actually sold to hospitals and doctors for legitimate uses, and this is all regulated by the federal government. There were special exemptions for Coke. You'll see it in our laws. It says decoconized coca leaf extract. They're the only company that is allowed essentially to bring in this coca leaf into the United States through this process from the Peruvian coca farmers to Maywood Chemical Company. Now, today that company was bought out by Stepan Chemical Company, and they continued that practice, again, as far as I was following it through the research into the 21st century. It's one of the things that's unique about Coca-Cola is that secret ingredient that almost no one else has access to. The law actually says that there are medicinal leaves that are meant for doctors, so the cocaine that comes out of those leaves can go to hospitals and doctors. But because Coke got so big, they had to create this category called special leaves. It's my favorite category. Because the special leaves are just for Coke. And all that cocaine has to be destroyed under federal supervision. And man, do I want to go see what that looks like. But it's behind closed doors, so I can't see it. But again, declassified DEA documents. I wrote that whole chapter based on that in the National Archives. Incredibly rich stuff. Remarkable story. So he takes out the coke leaf. That's the cocaine. That's a big deal because, let me just say one more thing about that. It has nothing to do with national laws banning cocaine sales in the United States. It has everything to do with race in the South. Because the press was talking about how cocaine was contributing to black crime in the South. Of course, it's just segregationist, racist ideology, totally false. But Coke was sitting there saying, oh my gosh. And a segregationist like Candler was saying, oh my gosh, we don't want to be associated with this. So weirdly, the South and Southern history matters here. Why the cocaine was removed had to do with racial fears, concerns about the product being associated with black crime. So he takes that out. But he does another really important thing. He decides to bottle Coca-Cola in 1899. And he does it reluctantly. He thought no one was going to drink bottled Coca-Cola. Come on, that's the weirdest thing ever. Isn't the whole point of drinking Coke that you're going to get at the fountain and enjoy it, with your friends? And it's the whole social aspect. No one's going to drink this stuff. And back then, and this is weird, spiders would find their way into these bottles. It was a really nasty industry, the bottling industry. I think there's one story of like a mouse. I'm like, are you really that bad that a mouse could get into your bottle and you wouldn't notice it as you're pouring in the Coca-Cola syrup? So he didn't want to do it, but he decides to do it, and it changed the game. I mean, it blew up everywhere. And Robert Woodruff, who would take over the brand in 1923, he saw this incredible explosion of Coke through these bottling networks, where there would be these little mom and pops, folks putting up $3,000. That's all it cost in many of these towns to start. And that actually is a lot of money, back in the early 20th century. And one of the things that makes this work is local banks and all these little places providing and lending money, the capital that was being brought in from all these little places to build these bottling plants. This is a terrible picture, but it's from the 1929 Coca-Cola annual report, and all those little dots represent different bottlers across the country. Jobbers were these little salesman folks who would go around and try and sell this stuff to different people. But you can see that there were, 1,250 bottlers all across the country by 1929, all over the map. And some of you may remember about how it worked, right? Back then, it was glass bottles. They were glass bottles, you got it for a nickel. And if you returned that bottle, you got your deposit back. You got a deposit of 1 to 2 cents. If you got a big crate, basically what it would boil down to is about, in some cases, 2 cents a bottle for bringing back your container. I went back and looked at the record. It's remarkable. These bottles did 90, 80 trips back and forth between consumer and bottle. We think of ourselves as so advanced today with recycling and everything else. It was an incredible system, and it worked. Reuse was in play, and we see this. And what's amazing, if you go to the trade journals back in the 20s, they say, don't be an idiot. Put a price, you'll like this part, put a price on that container because, you know, people will now have an incentive to bring it back, right? And they would chastise. They'd say it's the only sane and logical thing to do. Don't be a fool. Put a deposit on your container. So the question is, what happened? Well, in the 1950s and 60s, that's when Coca-Cola and the other soft drink companies began switching to one-way throwaway containers. And the idea here was that they wanted to consolidate their bottling networks. They thought they could achieve efficiencies by creating more centralized bottling networks. And to do that, they thought, well, look at these new aluminum cans. We can just have these one-way throwaway containers and send them out from these centralized distribution centers. We don't have to collect them, and we don't have to clean them and pay for all the water to do all that. And, you know, we're now in this automobile age where people want convenience. This is a much better package for us. But when they did that, they got rid of deposits. There was no deposits on those containers, and as a result, litter ended up all across the country. And so, industry got a lot of backlash. States began to say, what are we going to do about this? We've got to clean up this mess. Vermont and Oregon, naturally, led the way, saying, all right, we're going to put deposits, you know, states, mandatory deposits through state law. We're going to put a 5 to 10 cent price on these containers and use that incentive system to make sure people bring it back. The soft drink industry hated this because at this point they saw that as a kind of tax on their drinks that would raise the price of their drinks and as a result reduce sales. And so there was this big battle against these deposits. There was also in Congress in 1970, there was a law supported by over 20 members of the House of Representatives that would have banned all throwaway, non-deposit containers. Can you imagine what that world would have looked like had we actually been successful there? But that is the context, folks, and I know when I put this up, a lot of you are nodding your head because you've seen this. It was one of the most famous advertisements of American history. It's consistently listed at the top. It's called the Crying Indian Commercial, and it came out from Keep America Beautiful, which when I was reading about it, I thought, oh, it's like John Muir and Tree Huggers. Like, that's what Keep America Beautiful was all about. It was started by the beverage industry and the packaging industry. And this commercial comes out in 1971, right in the middle of that battle for mandatory deposits and the banning of these containers. And the argument was that the industry was trying to get across was, people start pollution. People can stop it. That consumers, that you are the problem. That you all are the litter bugs. And we don't need any systemic laws or regulations on this. If you would just throw away your container. we have this problem solved. And what was so appealing about that is that it's kind of true. If people did just throw away their containers, you know, we would clean it up. But the problem was people weren't. And so there was a real problem, and Coke kept fighting it. I actually snuck in to the American Beverage Association's lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. on K Street. We talk about how I got in, but I got it. And so I took pictures down in the lobby, down in their basement of a lot of their lobbying material. I had a lot of stuff, but this is the one I liked the most because it wasn't just adults. They were teaching kids, right? This was handy. I love them because it just teaches that hands alone cause litter, right? That, again, this idea of the litter bug and this whole messaging of like, it's all about volunteer efforts, it's all about, you know, just people doing these things on their own. We don't need any structural changes here. That's a big thing. And so Coke, at the time, had a president named Paul Austin who was looking at this problem in the 1960s. And I liked Paul Austin. I actually think he cared about the environment. I got to know him through his letters. He seems like one of those people that I really believed actually, you know, was worried about the planet. He gave these speeches to bankers in Atlanta, like slamming his hands down, saying, guys, if we don't do something about these pollution problems in our country, we're going to end up like the moon. You know, so he was thinking about these things, and he started a couple campaigns. One of them was the Bend a Little campaign, which featured this kind of provocative picture, which was really a step out of the traditional advertising for Coca-Cola, because it's kind of sexualized in this picture. And the idea was, we're just going to hand out a bunch of litter bags, made of plastic, by the way, to get people to pick up this stuff. And you know, they're doing everything they can to combat this image. But here's, I have just a couple of minutes here, but this is the best, this was the most exciting thing I realized they did. They didn't just try and, you know, do these litter campaigns with the bags and greenwashing, if you will. They actually did a study to figure out what is the most environmentally sound package that we can use. So they commissioned a study in 1969, I'll get to this date in a second, with this Midwest Research Institute group to look at aluminum cans, to look at even steel cans, which are still around too, to look at glass cans, to look at plastic bottles, which were just emerging at this time, and to say, on every metric, the water that's used to clean these things, the energy that's used to ship these things, the amount of litter that's, you know, thrown out, what's the best environmental package for us to use? I told you, Austin really did think about these things. This is the first life cycle analysis study, 69, and it was done by Coke, it was done privately. So I called up Coca-Cola. Ring, ring. By this point, I knew the answer was going to be, we hate you, go away, you know, pesky graduate student. And I said, but I know who the scientists were. I found out that it was Bob Hunt and Bill Franklin, who were William Franklin, who you see listed here. So I said, well, maybe they're around. And they were. So I called them up and I said, hey, do you have the study from 1969 that you did for Coca-Cola? I'd love to see what they knew in 1969. And he said, no, it's proprietary information, we can't share it. But he said, we did the exact same study for the EPA in 1974. Read the site. If you want to know what we did, just go over to your library. So, clink, and that's a plug for libraries, by the way. And so I ran over and I got this study in 1974, and it was super, super interesting, super cool. They looked at raw materials, they looked at energy footprint, they looked at water. Because a lot of people will say, oh no, but you got to clean all those bottles. They looked at that. They were like, well, is there more water use? I mean, it takes a lot of water to make the plastic bottles. So, and they looked at different things. So they looked at post-consumer waste, all these things. But they looked at a 19-trip returnable glass bottle. So a glass bottle that does at least 19 trips. And at this point, even as late as the 1970s, there were glass bottles in returnable systems that were doing well over that. So it was easy to get into that category. But they just said, let's make that the highest. Then there's the 10-trip returnable glass bottle, the 5-trip. Then they had these various composites. They had like plastic, they had aluminum steel composites, various different types of plastic composites. They had aluminum containers, they're just aluminum. And again, they said at the time, plastics were really just emerging. This is like the graduate, time, plastics. They did that, right? But they were looking at these things. And in '74, they were looking at it again, renewed. And here's why this matters. I promise you, this is the kind of concluding slides here. The study said conclusively that there was no throwaway container that would be improved to match or surpass that of a 10-trip returnable glass bottle in the near future. And that was in 1974, but also what they were saying in 1969 when Coke did the study. Now, I called up Franklin, and one of those things where like, let's get double sourcing on this, and talk to different people about this. But I talked to Bill Franklin and said, I'm not reading this right. Is this what you said? Is this what happened? That's what we said. That's what we said. And the reason I did that was because this is what Coke said. Citing that research, through our research, we are convinced that the plastic bottle is one of the most environmentally responsible packaging options available to us in the future. Students at Ohio State will say, villains, evil people. You said Austin was nice. You lied to us. And my response to them is, no. And it's a better lesson, I think, for them, especially a lot of these younger business students, to say, he saw what he wanted to see in that study. And this is how Franklin described it to me. He said they were stunned about the energy savings. They were stunned. That was the chief metric that they said, man, because look, it comes from fossil fuels. They thought, how could it possibly beat out, even though it's so lightweight, could it possibly, because it's a fossil fuel feedstock coming from petrochemicals, how could it possibly, outcompete these other packages? And this is, look, by 72, 73, 74, we're talking about the energy crisis. Energy is the big game in town. And the bigger thing was, he kept saying, it's recyclable. Like he believed, right, in this future technology that really wasn't fully tested at the time. But if indeed this stuff was fully recycled, then heck yeah, it's lightweight. You can use this stuff over and over. Let's go for it. This is going to be the best package for the future. And so Coke, instead of pushing for mandatory deposits, they kept battling. Every states were saying, no, we got to deal with this waste. Let's put a 5 to 10 cent price on these containers. No, you don't have to do it. They were probably, I looked at all the hearings in Congress. They were one of the biggest voices for curbside recycling. This is the panacea. We don't need those deposits. What we need is a comprehensive curbside recycling system. This will reclaim all of our waste. Well, this is the beauty of being a historian, right? You can look back and say, did that bet pay off? Did it work? And here's what we see. 1980s, we started seeing the beginnings of like curbside recycling. By the mid-1990s, we're talking about, dozens of cities, hundreds of cities across the country are getting involved. By the 2000s, of course, curbside recycling is firmly in place. And this goes on, again, over 2 decades beyond that to today. And this is where we're at with just PET plastic bottles. Just plastic bottles, not all plastic PET, just plastic bottles. All right, we have leveled off around 30%. And just to put a fine point on that, 70% of PET plastic bottles in this country end up, in landfills and rivers and streams and ultimately in our oceans. It is a broken system. It was a bet that didn't pay off. And the question is, how do we fix it? Coke says, and this is my last slide, that by 2030 they're going to reclaim every single bottle that they put out into the environment. And recently there was a report on an NPR affiliate that said, what do you think about that, Bart? And I said, well, look at their plan. It includes nothing about deposit systems, which we know, looking at other, we don't even have to look to the past. We can look at other countries that are using these incentive systems. And you can see reclamation rates in states, even in California, that are 70%. In some states, even 80, 90%. Because they have these deposits in place that put a price on the packaging to bring it back. We know it worked from history. We know it worked in places where it's used today. It's not the end-all, be-all solution to the packaging issue. But I think one of the things Kip and I were even talking about is, in the time that we have right now, while this system is functioning, what are one of the ways that you could find to reclaim most of that stuff that's going on in that environment? I think we know from history that the deposit system worked, but it was fought heavily. And I'll tell you, when I was in the basement of that lobbying firm, you could see how aggressively they were fighting. Every state, they were spending millions of dollars in each state to prevent statewide deposit systems in Ohio from going into effect, in other parts of the country, my home state of Georgia, and they won. But as I would argue that one of the reasons we see this in this country is because there's no incentive for it. There's no incentive to bring it. That has no value. It is just waste. It is seen as waste. It's treated as waste. And that's why it ends up as waste in our oceans. So I think we can learn something here from this. One way we can curb pollution is to go back to that past, to take stock of how it worked and to use it again. Recycle and all that did. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
A lot of the labels on food products, like Cokes and natural flavors, is that proprietary information? And if so, how did you get it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I also want to just say one other thing about a label, so let's remind me if I don't get to it. So let me be brief on this one. If you're trying to do this type of history, and I'm thinking about people who are going to be writing these types of histories down the road, you've got to have a base of sources. And when I originally started to write this, I reached out to Coke and said, can I get into your corporate archives? And they said no. So I was like, well, I can't write this book. And then I found out that Robert Woodruff, who literally was called the boss of Coca-Cola, donated 300 boxes of his personal correspondence to the to Emory University. And that is where this treasure trove of information comes from. It was incredible what was in there. And they thought they were being smart, like, don't merchandise number 5, and then somebody would slip up and be like, coca leaves, and they'd be like, stop writing that. But it's still in there, right? And you kind of triangulate from these documents, and it's clear as day. I mean, you can actually go, into Wikipedia now, and they're like, this is merchandise number 1, 2, and 5. And generally, I do not send anyone to Wikipedia because of all the issues with accuracy. It's pretty accurate. I mean, based on what I've seen from the archives, they've got the numbers down right. So part of it was Robert Woodruff's papers. I mean, it was a huge collection for me. And then you have to triangulate out who else has papers. Bottlers who were very proud of their bottling system. They're building a bottling plant wherever they were. They would donate boxes to various archives. And one was in Richmond, Central Coca-Cola Bottling Company. Huge, because Coke's writing to them. This is how we're going to attack mandatory deposits. And they kept them, and they gave them to an archive. So really rich stuff that was there. And I think that goes to the heart of what we do as historians. It's not on Google, but it is in these libraries and it is in these archives. And when people give those things over, it's pretty wild. But one thing I'll say about labeling, you'll see the plant bottle a lot. Coca-Cola created this plant bottle as a way of saying, look at our label, or look at how we're becoming green. But if you read that label very closely, and I hope you do, I was looking around to see if there was a Dasani bottle on it. It's like, no Coke products, this is amazing. But if you look at it, it says up to 30% plant materials. So my math majors always say, well, Bart, that could be 0. And I say, that's true. And then the other question is, well, what is the plant? And this is, again, I think the beauty of environmental history is, like, we're always saying, well, get back to the source. What is it that actually is being used to make that? Is it a sustainable product in the first place? And the answer is, well, what would you think?
Corn.
I'd think corn, right? And that's what I thought at first. It's actually sugarcane. It's sugarcane byproducts. So, right, the only way this works is through their massive sugarcane plantations that they're sourcing from having access to, and you could argue, well, at least they're reusing stuff, right? When we think about sustainable agriculture, I don't think sugarcane is the first thing that comes to mind, right? So I think it's like labels matter, and I think they've done a great job at creating labels that look great, but hide more than they reveal. Yeah.
Can we assume that the flavor with the Coke is the difference between Coke and RC and cross-cutting colas and Pepsi? Is the Coca leaf a part of that, or do they all have that?
Yeah, they don't. And one of the cool things in the National Archives, and you'll see in the back, another plug and plugging, but in the back of the book I have the record group. You can go to the National Archives and just look at these things. If you're ever in DC, it's super fascinating because record group 59, the DEA declassified documents. These companies were writing to the federal government. We know that Coke's got this thing. We'd like to have it too. And the federal government was reluctant to be open about how they could get access to it because they wanted this restricted. They didn't want a lot of people bringing in coca leaves into the United States. And so it's amazing, they kind of deflect these folks and say, well, go ask Maywood. And then I'd find the letters from Maywood. And this is what Maywood would say. This is true. Maywood wrote to Coke and said, this, and I can't remember which one, it was RC or one of them, wrote us, it says they want the coca leaf. Is that okay? I think you know the answer, right? And it was, emphatic. Like, you're going to do this, we'll go to Merck, or we'll find someone else to do this for us. And for Maywood, dang, that's a big business, right? You got this company that operates all around the world. Yes, sir. And so it's an interesting dynamic. It wasn't just legal. It was also the way that Coke kind of used its buying power to kind of put pressure on that single firm that pulled this stuff in to have this unique ingredient. The last thing I'll say on this is, the chapter goes into this. They created their own secret cocoa farm in Hawaii, Coca-Cola did in the 1960s, because they still weren't satisfied that they were going to be able to get this secret ingredient. And they couldn't figure out where to grow the coca leaves because it only grows in certain, climes and certain environments. So they're like, we'll do it in the Virgin Islands. And then they're like, it's too many partiers here. So where can we do it? Kauai. And this is totally true. They actually had a secret cocoa farm in Kauai. And the University of Hawaii oversaw barbed wire fences where they grew their own coca leaves. And they did it for a couple of years. The problem was in environmental history, we know this, we could have told them this was going to happen. Nature fights back. You've taken this thing, you put it in this new environment. So this native fungus to Hawaii just said, yum, yum, yum. Shoom, it just went through and ate all of that coca leaf up. And then the federal government that's looking at this is so fun, just the twists and turns. It's like, oh my gosh, a fungus that wipes out coca crops. Useful, right? And so this is the story, and again, off the record. Well, I wouldn't say off the record. I'd just say a really great next research project would be something I couldn't finish or couldn't confirm. Because you gotta understand, for me, it was the legal issue. I was really worried. I gotta get everything right. I wanna make sure that what I say is accurate because they're not gonna be very happy about talking about it. So one thing I wanna follow up on, and I think would be a great research project is, there is evidence to suggest that in the 1990s there were these fungal outbreaks in the center of Peru and a lot of the coca leaf producing areas, especially in areas where there was a lot of narco trafficking. And that fungus was, the farmers would say, were dropped by DEA airplanes, and they called it uvea blanca, white rain. And it wiped out tomato crops and other things like that. And it seems to be the exact same kind of fungus that they would have found in Hawaii. Now, again, alleged and unconfirmed, but I think a project that would be really interesting to see what would happen there. Yes, sir?
Your earlier slide, we had 1,500 distribution or bottling.
Yeah, 1,200.
Were those franchisees?
Yeah, so they were.
I have a question, whether they were not.
Yeah.
How did the corporate entity control their, they have to sign non-disclosure agreements to get the franchise or the distribution rights?
Yeah.
And the second question is, did you personally experience any attempts to restrain publication of your book or any legal or if there were threats or innuendos about the publication of your book, or?
Yeah, well, let me start with that one, and then I'll go to the other one. You'll see on the back of the book that there are 2 quotes. One is from the Wall Street Journal. Actually, Mike, do you want to just read the quote from Coca-Cola, since you have it? Because I can't remember. I don't know what it's like.
It says, Citizen Coke demonstrates a complete lack of understanding about the Coca-Cola system, past and present.
Yeah, so so it's not a ringing endorsement of the book. After I did. And so to your point, I think what's interesting, and like, there's so many different folks here, but I'm also thinking about like people who are writing stuff. And like, I think the thing that matters here is like, they didn't really think about me when I was, writing my graduate dissertation. I think they thought, oh, a dissertation, maybe it'll just end up in the library and it won't. Yeah, and it was interesting when it went with Norton, which is a trade press, and was kind of out there. It was all of a sudden, it was like, boom, it was a big difference. So it was interesting, it was almost like no pressure. I mean, they were definitely like, we're not giving you access, and it was kind of like a gnat, like, go away, go away. And then when it came out, it was a little bit nervous. I remember kind of being like, this, because I wrote a piece in the Atlanta Business Chronicle, which in hindsight, it's kind of like right in their backyard, and I thought, maybe I should have done that. And they wrote a response, and then they were kind of following me. I wrote a piece for Fortune magazine, and they basically sent the exact same article to Fortune magazine the day after I wrote it, and said, you need to publish this or else. Fortune turned them down. They wrote me and said, Bart, Coke's writing us.
They're still part of the Time publishing?
Yeah, exactly. They were still part of Time. It's Fortune, and they said, well, I said, thank you, why? And they said, well, we went back to them and said, you said that this is inaccurate, whatever they said there. And so we asked them, what's inaccurate? And he sent me a paraphrase of their email, and it said something like, well, nothing that he says is inaccurate, we just disagree with his interpretation. To which Fortune said, that's not good enough. And weirdly, after that, things kind of died down. And I have to say I'm kind of like happy about that. Because I will say, I gave this talk on Monsanto the other day, and Monsanto called the university after I gave my talk. And it's very similar to this stuff. You'll see that I have citations and things like that. It's because I really believe in the craft of what we do. Knowledge is power. And that university, which it asked me not to mention their name because of the potential blowback they would get, but they said they turned them down as well. They said, look, we saw the presentation. We're not in the business of giving you free PR to come in and do this. So that's that. And, but I have a 2-year-old son, and you're sitting there and you're getting these things from these companies, and somebody says, well, why don't people do business history? And I think part of it is because they're real and they're not dead, And I think for me it was one of the reasons I do it now is because I feel like I understand the craft better and I have almost an obligation to do it. The other question was about bottlers. They did have very strict contracts with them, and the bottling contracts, explained the parameters of where they could sell to, how they were going to handle the syrup. It was very, very explicit, including for the international bottlers. It was actually really unique. Sugar was expensive. They outsourced sugar sourcing to their international bottling contracts. They couldn't do that for their domestic bottlers because when they signed those original domestic bottling contracts in the United States, sugar was in the syrup. But they were smart in the 1920s when they started going global. They said, why pay for the sugar? Make the bottler pay for the sugar. So Mexican Coke, which has real sugar in it, sugarcane sugar. Or when you go to the Netherlands, you'll have beet sugar in your Coca-Cola. That's because their bottling contracts actually outsourced the most important ingredient in terms of cost, which is sugar, to those places. But the other thing they would do is they had this thing called a traveling laboratory. This little white ambulance, this little Coca-Cola. I'd be scared out of my mind if I was a bottler, if this thing pulled up into my thing, because they would get out and they'd have this lab equipment. And the biggest thing was their water. They would test your water, and they'd be like, it's too hard, or it's too soft. You need to add this or that. But to my point about not owning stuff, how they did it, well, you got to fix it. We're not going to give you a bunch of money to fix it. You're going to fix it, right? And so for me, the bottlers are kind of the heroes of the story. Like, they actually make this thing possible. They do all this incredible work to get this thing out there. Coke kind of stands out.
Growing up in a small town in Ohio in the 50s and 60s, the most fun any junior high school kid could have was to get a tour of the local Coke.
Totally. And one of the things that's interesting is when they started gobbling up those bottlers, they knew that they were losing that social capital to fight these battles. So they created this network called the Civic Action Network, or the Coke Can, in the 1990s and 2000s. I joined it. And I wrote an entire chapter based on emails I got from Coca-Cola telling me what to do. When Mayor Bloomberg banned the 16-ounce container of soda, I got an email with the mayor's Twitter account, his phone number, how to contact him, what to do. So when people say, how do you know their strategy? They emailed it to me, you know? And I found that in the lobbying firm's archive, how to join the Civic Action Network, and it's really amazing. So interestingly, as those bottlers got gobbled up, they were trying to find ways to create networks that would be like that, to create that goodwill.
Why did they start buying back those franchisees?
I would kind of, there's a lot of answers to that. My answer, and I think it's a good one, based on what I've read, is kind of that story of the young whippersnappers coming out of Harvard Business School. It made sense from a kind of efficiencies argument. Let's buy these bottlers, invest in them, make this system much more efficient, and we won't have a kind of clunky, disaggregated, and it had already been pretty centralized, right? And I remember when they did that, I thought, when I first started writing this, I said, wow, that's become my whole argument of the book. It was kind of later. It's like, they don't run things. Why are they doing this? And then, guess what they ended up doing recently? Refranchising all those bottlers. Because they started looking at the margins. The margins were piss poor. It was one of the biggest money losers on Fortune, listings. It was like just a total mess. They're what was called Coca-Cola Enterprises. It's super expensive, right? And that's not how you make money like Coke. They like to make margins like this. And so I'd argue that it was a new generation coming in, kind of rethinking how they're going to do it. You could argue, though, that it kind of worked by investing in that and kind of getting out, right? They did create these really efficient mega bottlers and are profiting from that today. But for the most part, their history has been stand out. Let these people do it. Yes, sir.
Who makes the machinery, the machinery, and all of the computerization and so on that goes on? Is that central, or who owns that?
It's a good question. I didn't go as much into computers as I might have, and I don't really know who their computer suppliers are. But I'll say again, like, one of the things they do really well is have, various vendors trying to always keep their options open, having a lot of different suppliers, so that if something changes, they can kind of switch. And again, that high fructose corn syrup example is the best one. Like, that's the thing everyone, I think, forgets if they're not thinking about this model. It's like, they just switched in '85. I mean, they could just do it, and they didn't really lose much money when they did that, because they can source from a different source as well. So I don't know exactly who their computer suppliers are.
That was my question.
Yeah.
The machinery that when you go in those plants,
Yeah.
and you look at the efficiency of those machines,
Yeah.
and the beauty of the machines, they're
Right, like the bottling networks and
all that
systems.
stuff.
Yeah.
Now, who owns that?
Not Coke, right?
It must be a different company that makes that stuff.
Yeah, but I don't know exactly who the suppliers are. There's probably multiple folks that they're buying from or getting that sourcing from. But it's interesting. You'd see these pivoting moments where they could just change on a dime with something, and it was really remarkable how they did this. And when they did that, by the way, with high fructose corn syrup, they actually charged their bottlers world sugar prices for their syrup when they switched to high fructose corn syrup. So this is how that system works even within the system. They were profiting off their own bottlers by selling their syrup to the bottlers at a much higher price than the high fructose corn syrup, which was going into the bottles. And they were then sued, and they lost that case. The bottlers, my dad was a lawyer and worked on that case. He represented the Coca-Cola bottlers. One of the sources of material I have was Coca-Cola bottlers' documents in that court case against Coca-Cola. And the story is weird, and I'll just tell you all, because again, it's kind of these mysteries I never was able to unlock. They win the case. It's about a 10-year case, the bottlers do. Because it was obvious. It's like, you guys are overcharging these bottlers. You're charging them world sugar prices with tariffs and everything else on it. Versus high fructose corn syrup was super cheap. You're making a ton of money. Hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is true. The judge for that case, who was going to find in favor of the bottlers, got sick. He recused himself from the case, said he couldn't continue. And they put another judge on the case who reversed the decision. And not...
Was it a federal case?
It was a federal case.
Federal district.
Yeah. And so they reversed the decision, and they actually found that there was, they said that it was wrong, that they shouldn't have done it, but it was like $1 in damages, so not $100 million that they were going to get or something. And the question my dad always has is, what the heck happened to that judge? But we don't know. I don't know. Yeah. Well, sorry, let me grab one other report.
What would you say about the time when there was the new Coke?
Okay.
That was, then there was the bag
Lots of
package,
things.
so they went back.
Let me try and look. It's so funny because, Coke is like, there's just so many stories, right? And this new Coke one is fascinating. So let me just say one thing. There is strong evidence to suggest, and this is from the reporting of a journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who I trust, who wrote a really good book on Coke. His name is Mark Pendergrass. He found a document that I also cite that shows that Coke took out the Coke leaf for New Coke. I could talk about a lot of things with New Coke. Like, Pepsi had got Michael Jackson, I could do my best, the moonwalk and all this, and they were trying to compete with them. They were trying to make it a sweeter drink. They'd done all these taste testing, all this stuff. But one of the things they changed, the evidence suggests, is the taking out of that Coke leaf that we were talking about. But it was such a fiasco. As many of you remember when New Coke came out. And this is what's interesting. Internally, they're like, well, maybe it really is significant, right? And internally, we know for sure by 1988, the last time they acknowledged in the press, in the New York Times, that they had the Coke leaf in the drink is 1988. So if they took it out in 85, it's definitely back in, at least by 1988. But part of that is maybe it's obvious. It's Reagan, war on drugs, right? And this concern about drugs is like on front page news. Why continue this really touchy, relationship for this weird flavor of the Coca leaf if you can get out of it?
But it wasn't selling either. I mean, they had to be.
Yeah. It was terrible. But my point is that it was so bad when they had to get out of New Coke, right? But them putting it back in, right, is a suggestion that like, ooh, we shouldn't futz with this formula, And you see that, and you might say, well, come on, really, do they really think that? If you read these letters, I mean, they say that internally in the 40s. They're like, we could never take the Coca leaf out. The public would know. But they don't even know it's in there, I mean, like, that's like, I'm reading these letters, and it's just like, it's almost like it's like being inside a church or kind of a religious organization when you're reading some of these documents, because it's like, the myth of the secret formula pervades even the VPs, in the firm. Yeah.
You probably have a million stories like this, but I was in Mali maybe 25, 30 years ago. I lived in West Africa, and I went to a village and to meet the chief, and sure enough, he pulled out a cold bottle of Coca-Cola. It's just amazing. It's like, how do you get Coca-Cola here? Anyway, my question to you is, given global warming and how disastrous this is looking for our world, is Coca-Cola taking any steps to mitigate their harm on our environment?
They're trying to, but here's what I usually say when I get to this. I think the big finding of the book, when you point out that Coke doesn't own things, is that believing, and a lot of people do, I think, in corporate responsibility, look, the corporation will save us. Like if we change them, they will change it. The reality is, they don't have the means to change it, right? The recycling systems is a great example. We pay for that. We build that. We set the rules, is another way of putting it, right? And so, I get asked this a lot. Can Coke do this? That's the thing about this pledge that drives me nuts. They say, we will reclaim every single package. You can't do that, Coke, because you don't own those systems that reclaim most of this. You outsourced all that. We paid for that. And so I think that Citizen Coke, the title and the ending of the book, is really about citizen empowerment. It's about what we as citizens can do to set the rules.
But they can write contracts.
What's that?
But they can write contracts.
They can, but we could say, just to make a small example, as a state, and say, no, if you want to operate in our state, here's what we're going to do with bottles. Here's what we're going to do with packaging. And this is what's so interesting to me. Coke will say, in all their campaigns against these mandatory deposits, oh no, if you do that, we'll lose jobs. All of our bottling plants will shut down. We can't possibly handle it. We can't do it at all.
Thousands of jobs.
Thousands of jobs. But you can reclaim every single package in the world. It's pointing out that kind of like, do you believe in big business? You can't handle that 5 to 10 cents Coke. You're even telling me you can do wild things, right? And I think, I joke to people, they say, you must hate big business. Like, I don't hate big business. I just believe they can do better. You know what I mean? I think we can set the rules as citizens of this country, citizens of the globe, as you say, climate change, and watch innovation happen, watch interesting things happen. In some ways you could argue that's believing in business, right? Believing that if we put the right pressures on, we'll see some pretty interesting things. I think that's the game changer. I think so long as we let corporate social responsibility tell us how they're handling things, we're going to be in trouble. Yeah, okay.
So why would you presume that we know better what Coca-Cola should do right now with this than McDonald's? Who was the president who put them on
Ray
plastics?
Oh no, who put them on
Who put them on plastics because energy prices were skyrocketing, and who sat there and said, how do I make a good environmental decision? At the time, it was a good environmental decision, even though some of the costs we can look at backwards. So why would we presume that we know better than he did then, trying to do the right thing environmentally to get the outcome that we want, since the outcome from that is what we're dealing with right now?
Yeah, I mean, again, you could go back to this, though, and say, this guy seemed to know what he was talking about, right? I mean, he did have data. What he went with.
But wasn't it the energy data on this, even though all the
you're right.
data pointed to, well, economically, if we're a corporation, we ought to go with the 19 return, but we're going to be environmentally responsible, and so we're going to follow the trends of energy. I mean, that looks like that kind of decision, and so I'm wondering why, if in the right moment even, the right environmental decision leads to this that we would presume today would be better.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I think, I think that I can certainly put myself inside the firm and see how pitfalls can happen like this one, where you make this bet and you do this. It's because you're facing these kind of pressures of cost and things like that, and you're thinking, well, yes, I'm being told very clearly and in multiple spots that the best thing for me to do is this gin-trip returnable container, but because of these pressures I'm facing within the firm, and the bottom line, and Michael Jackson, well, Michael Jackson wasn't there yet, but right, I've got to do X. I think that's the danger of these big, grand decisions, coming from within these firms, is that it can miss a lot. And I'm not saying that we necessarily always have the right answers as citizens as well. And you could argue that one of the issues with this is this. I barely got access to this, right? That the asymmetries of information are deeply problematic. If Coke is for real, about wanting for all of us to solve the problem, I go to your point. Share the information. Let's all be a part of a conversation. It doesn't strike me that we're going to get at the best answers to environmental sustainability by having a few, and in this case, all men, in one room making a decision. Some of the best ideas have been created, we think about computers, as I mentioned earlier, through the homebrew club, that's sharing the hobbyists, and that open source kind of discussion and debate. You could argue universities, one of the great places where we still have this. And you challenging me right now, man, making me sweat bullets, right? And think about, but that's it, right, Kip? Like that, I think, is a different way of thinking about this. That is not about salvation through the corporation, but salvation through, sure, I'll be in conversation with them, but it has to be open. And I don't think that's the way it is. I went through this process and it was killer. Like if they really cared about a discussion about it, we would have been sharing and discussing, right?
Can I piggyback just really quick, and I apologize. This idea, the fact that New Coke didn't work, so this whole, the problem with Coke is all this behavior, and what's the elephant in the room is that I like Coke, and a lot of people do, and they drink it, and in fact, when they changed the flavor, we noticed, so it wasn't just something that was being pressed out, but it was something that was actually being drawn in. There was a demand for it that superseded just some manufacturer demand or some manufacturer requirement. And so it seems to me that there's something in that it's everywhere, not just because Coca-Cola is this brilliant marketer, but they also, I think, maybe happened onto something that really tastes good. Like,
no doubt.
That the human taste buds that we all probably share enough of, somehow it satisfies in a physiological way as well. So it's not just nefarious, like they're responding to demand too, and they're responding to our wants.
I think you're absolutely right. And by the way, one of the ways they created that perfect profile was by cutting the sweetness of it with phosphoric acid, which by the way comes from phosphate rock, of all things. And the mining of that also produces radioactive waste, but I'm not going to go into that. But it was an amazing, creation. And poor Pemberton never really gets to see it become this great thing. On the other hand, you could also argue, why not Pepsi? It just doesn't taste as good. But the real answer there is that that's true. Coca-Cola got government contracts to go overseas with the troops. And Dwight Eisenhower wrote directly to the War Production Board to get that. And boy, do you want to read some tough letters? Read Pepsi's letters in the National Archives saying, "What are you doing, U.S. military? You're picking, as they put it, one candy manufacturer over another." They don't want to mention themselves or Coke. And it's like, it was a game changer. I mean, think about people, my grandfather was, in World War II, drink a Pepsi, get that out of your hand. You kidding me? That's not what happened when we were, at D-Day or wherever it was, right? We had a Coke. And so that was a huge moment for Coke. Millions, I think it was like, I forget how many billions, like 2 billion Cokes that were sold to the troops during that time period, and that veteran allegiance afterwards was really remarkable. So yeah, there's certainly the biological and the taste, and it's good, but there are also these structural decisions that had a big impact.
You've given me the incentive to start a new business.
I'm excited.
Because you raised the question, you opened the niche, and now it's there. And that is degradable plastic. Now, when I make my degradable plastic company, then I'm going to sell it to these people on a very lucrative basis.
Right.
And that's the next way to go. So I think the solution is not so much with the bottles and collecting and all that. It's to get to degradable plastics for the future, so you don't have to think. As soon as you have to think, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So that's what that's the niche that I would find.
No doubt. And I would say, but I would also say, not just degradable, but rethinking how we deliver beverages in general. Rethinking about the process of how we get this thing to the consumer. There's all this great thinking about natural capitalism. One of the great examples is, Carrier, the air conditioning company, not thinking about themselves as selling units of Carrier machines, but they're just in the business of selling coolness. in both ways, I guess. So sell coolness, right? Like sell the service that you need to sell. Maybe it's through geothermal or whatever, but like rethink what it is you're selling. For Coke, I guess it's happiness, right? They sell happiness. I think that's the beginning of something. But I think you're right. Like totally rethinking, okay, I'm in the business of delivering this fluid to people that's tasty. How can I do that? It might not be degradable single-use containers, right? But I think you're right. But all I'd say is, if we put pressures, and I think some kind of pressures and levers that say, we don't think this is good. This seems, get to it, wasteful. I think we can all agree on that. And this is to the point the lady asked, it's wonderful. This question of, does it come from inside the firm? I don't think they're going to pivot. Look at how long they haven't pivoted. They've known how bad it was, for years. Until we create the environment that says, innovate. Come up with something better. Because this ain't working.
What about cans?
Cans, I mean, the thing about aluminum cans, it has higher recycling rates, but still, 50% or more ends up in most states.
But people drink what they want to drink based on what it tastes like, or their susceptibility to advertising. Pepsi sells more in grocery stores in the United States because they pay the grocery store to have more shelf space. So kids grow up drinking Pepsi because that's what their mother brings home from the grocery store. I drink Coca-Cola, regular Coke. I've never had a Diet Coke, and I drink it out of the can. It doesn't taste the same in a bottle to me. It doesn't get as cold. It doesn't have as much fizz. I'm not going to drink it out of the bottle unless that's all there is.
Yeah.
So, a big part of this is all corporations, particularly public ones, answer first to their stockholders. That's a problem, either a good or a bad one, okay, depending on which side of the fence you're on that one. Consumers buy what they want to buy. And what's interesting is if something costs a little bit more, if it would cost Coke a little more to do this or that could affect their sales. It probably didn't or wouldn't, but they think it would.
Right.
Okay, and that's a big problem. We have a situation in town here that they were putting a tax on tickets, okay, on tickets, a little tax to save the arts, okay, and half the people were against it, because, and the people selling the tickets were against it, because it was going to cost a little more, and maybe less people would go to the Ohio Theater or whatever. So the consumer still speaks with the right hand, and the corporations speak with the left hand, because they have different interests. One is how it tastes, and the other is how much money I made selling the corn syrup.
Right.
And we're always going to deal with that balance, no matter what. It doesn't matter if it's Coke or Pepsi. We were talking at dinner tonight. Pepsi buys into restaurants.
Right.
And so a lot of restaurants, you ask for Coke, they tell you we have Pepsi products.
And I'll say, again, having seen all their lobbying materials as an industry, we think of Pepsi and Coke as arch rivals. But if you get into the lobbying firm, it's like all best friends in there, right? They're all fighting for the same things collectively. And I would say to some degree this isn't necessarily, I always say, it's not really a book just about Coke. It's about the industry as a whole. To your point about people liking cans, I think that's true. I mean, I think years ago, that would not be the case. One of the biggest issues was how to design a can that would contain the pressure of soft drinks, about twice the pressure of beer. So one of the biggest issues is the brewing industry started with can stuff in the 1930s. And soft drinks were much later because they exploded out of those early cans. And their pH, Coke's pH is like 2.4, something like that. So I can put it on, battery to clean things. It ate through a lot of the early linings of the cans. And so here's my issue with the can from a design standpoint, is that the way that they solved that was by creating a polymer lining that now lines the inside of your can, which makes it taste for you good because it doesn't interact as much with the metal, because it used to eat through the metal. Although I'll tell you, if you leave a can long enough on your desk, as I have done, because I get a lot of Coke for some reason as a gift, like an apple for a teacher, and I'm always like, that's an interesting choice. And I left one for an entire year on my desk, and I kid you not, about 2 weeks ago, I went into my office, and there was a hole, and it was just oozing out. It had eaten through the lining, and it had eaten through the can. Now that's rare, and I hadn't had a can for that long. It might have been a year and a half.
You're not relating that to what happens to your body, are you? Because the can can't urinate.
That's true. No. I'm not saying you're going to, dissolve from the inside out, sir. No. But I think but I think that the design itself is problematic because one of the things we think about when we think about smart design, and we have a wonderful scholar in our department, Dave Staley, who thinks a lot about design, is biomimicry and not mixing things together that are hard to unpack, right? And so creating products that are made of the materials that you can easily extract and reuse those things. So I think when we think about the future container, that's going to be one of the things is how easy is this? Is it mixed with a bunch of things? That's the issue with the can, even as the metal. It's like there's different metal on top, and so there's a lot of kind of impurities that can happen through that recycling system.
So there's another option, of course, and that is to sell the syrup and have the people use their
faucets.
Their soda makers and just make it at home.
Well, SodaStream, obviously, a company out of Israel that had this, and I actually use the SodaStream, and I think it's great. But the Coke, interestingly, had this technology, and I wish I could show you all the trade journal. It's awesome. Back from I want to say in the 90s was when they first really conceived it, where it was literally a little syrup packet that would fit just like a little Brita filter, but on your faucet. It's kind of like crazy, and it's like just turn the dial and you've got Coke. I was just trying to think about. I guess the carbonation was somehow in there too, but it was really remarkable.
Put Alka-Seltzer in it.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean,
Why did they move forward with it?
I don't know what happened with that technology. It was just one of those things that I saw in their own bottling magazines, and then it just kind of faded away, and I don't know what didn't work about it. Because obviously SodaStream has done really, really well with that model. Maybe it was too early. I don't know. Maybe we'll see it come back.
Or have you or any of your colleagues, or any political science, maybe more appropriate, studied the politics of the whole bottle legislative battles in the late 60s, 70s? This is not said in defense of Coke, but most of those efforts are done through trade associations, so they're collaboratively.
Yeah.
Obviously collaboratively doing it through trade associations.
Yeah.
And cover trade associations.
Yes, absolutely.
Have there been any studies of the politics of those episodes?
I've read
When I lived through my boss in Ohio was on the right side of that issue, but he paid dearly for it. But fascinating politics.
Yeah, so I read about two things. One thing is Coke does do a lot of astroturfing, which is the word that's coined that describes kind of
As
this
opposed to grassroots.
Grassroots, right? That you're using corporations to the corporations are kind of creating a sense that it's grassroots, but it's really coming from the corporate entities. And yeah, they
corporations.
Yeah, exactly. But the more interesting thing here is that what Coke did in all these battles, especially at the federal level, was they sent not a traded person, like from some trade association. They sent the smallest bottler they could find.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Oh,
from Kentucky.
Oh,
and he or whatever. And he would
damn influential in that community.
Exactly. And he would show up, hey, I'm Joe from here. And that was clear as day, their big, and a lot of firms do this, but for Coke and that's why that small town bottler network was so powerful too at the federal level. It represented the face of Main Street so effectively in those campaigns. And Joe could say, Bob, you're my congressman, and you're from my district. And so that ability to appeal on that personal
more
level.
effective at the state level.
Yeah, and you could see it. I mean, they'd said it. They'd be like, I was going to vote for this thing that was going to prevent this from happening. But then I thought about what Joe said about jobs. And it's like, wow, thank you for that quote, because it really did turn the tide on some of these issues.
Folks, we have put Bart through his paces tonight, and I know that he will be around for a little bit if you want to come ask him further questions. I want to just thank you all for coming and to thank Bart for a great talk.